Today on Stronger Than Reason, I clean up 3 loose ends. Welcome to Stronger Than Reason. So this is going to be a brief episode today. I think it's a good idea to now and then sprinkle some shorter episodes in with the usual fare. Plus, I'm just really crunched for time this week and don't have the time to spend on producing a full episode. But I do intend for the next episode to be something special, and I'm diligently working on bringing that to you all. But until then, let's give this a go. There are 3 things that I want to touch on here. The first item is something I posted on YouTube earlier this week, the passing of the great, inimitable Douglas McCarthy, who was, of course, the main vocalist for Nitzer Ebb. I don't know what to say about this. The main thing I loved about Nitzer Ebb was Doug's voice. It was so powerful and unique. I was amazed it could come out of a normal-looking human dude. So to me, I always thought of Doug as like an amazing voice actor, like the guy who plays Homer Simpson. You know, when you see Homer's voice coming out of that guy, it's kind of mind-boggling. And it's the same for me when I'd watch a video of Doug singing. My mind was boggled how anyone could make that voice. He just sounded so cool. So when you marry that up with Bon Harris's super minimalist bass and beats, you had something totally magical. As we all know, simplicity is power, and you would be hard-pressed to find simpler, more powerful music than Nitzer Ebb. It's about as simple as it gets. And Doug's voice was always right there, in your face, like a drill instructor. You could practically feel the spit. Now, I can only speak for myself, but if you're the kind of person who looks for music with a certain kind of oomph, you probably get off on music like this, like Nitzer Ebb's That Total Age, for instance. The song Murderous is still my favorite, although Warsaw Ghetto is a close second. These songs showcase Nitzer Ebb in a raw way that the later, more refined tracks just can't touch. But I still love the stuff from their second album, Belief, especially the singles, which I think rock way harder than the album. And of course, my first love, their third album, Showtime. It was my first taste of the Ebb. Getting Closer was the first track of theirs I ever heard, and I still love it. All of this was transformative stuff for me, and I ate it up. Those albums have been a deep part of my DNA for 35 years. I gave an episode to each of them, so I'm not going to rehash them here. You can go back and listen if you want. Showtime, though, was important enough to me that it was episode 2. You know, I was going to do an episode here soon, just sort of panning their 4th album, Ebbhead, just for fun. But you know what? I can't do that now. And also, Ebbhead really is not terrible. I actually like the music quite a bit. I really just don't like the cover. It is terrible, and I will die on that hill. It's just the worst album cover ever. Don't like it. But I'm going to put a moratorium on the Ebbhead episode, for better or worse, for a little while now, because I just need some time to process the fact that Doug is really gone. I mean, I just talked about him on the Recoil episode, so his influence was wider than just Nitzer Ebb. You have his collaborations with Alan Wilder, with Terrence Fixmer, the D. Krups guys, and I've never heard a bad thing about Doug. In years of following Ebb interviews and whatnot, Alan had especially great things to say about him on his website back in the day. Doug just seemed like a great guy, so it's really sad what happened. I watched the interview Doug did with Kevin Key on Kevin's YouTube channel a couple years ago, and another recent interview he did with Bon, and all I could think watching was, wow, you know, he looks really thin. I hope he's okay. And I guess maybe seeing that prepared me in a way. So I wasn't super surprised when a friend told me about him passing, but it's still a shock. You know, I'm not normally someone who's affected by, you know, celebrities passing away, but this seemed a bit more personal to me. And I was saddened by it. I really was. Doug gave a lot to his fans. I think he deserved a longer life. I think he was only 57. But I guess, from what he said, and I'm not disclosing anything here that he himself didn't disclose, he had struggles with substance abuse, and a lot of people do. And, at the end of the day, he paid for them. And I don't know what to say about that. I really don't, other than I feel like he deserved better than he got. So that's the thing. There's just no justice here for those of us that loved his music, other than, I guess, to keep that music alive and still listen to it and still talk about it. And to Bond's credit, he's keeping the band going, even though Doug stepped away from live performance last year. Bond took over vocal duties, and as I stated in the past episodes, he's done a great job with it. Is he Doug? No, of course not. No one is. No one can replace Doug's voice. But Bond also sang a lot of these songs with Doug, going back to the start of the band, so he rightly claims the role of Nitzer Ebb lead singer, and more power to him. I've never seen Nitzer Ebb live, I'm sad to say, so I'll never see them with Doug. But maybe someday I can catch them with Bond. I hope so. Anyway. Okay, on to the second item, which is something that just recently came to my attention. However, it's been public knowledge since way back in March. And that is the news that one of my favorite bands has reunited. Yes, that's right. Against all odds, the Beta Band has reformed. A band so important to me that I featured their debut compilation album way back in episode 9. So for those who are scratching their heads wondering, who the hell is the Beta Band? They are best remembered in the U.S. for a scene in the film High Fidelity. It was a 2000 film starring John Cusack and Jack Black that adapted the classic novel by Nick Hornby. So if you're a music fan of a certain age, you've most likely seen that movie, and you probably remember the scene where John's character, the record store owner, declares that he's going to sell a bunch of copies of the 3 EPs by the Beta Band, and he proceeds to spin their song Dry the Rain. That scene was enough to make me a fan for life, and I proceeded to devote the next 4 years to devout Beta Band fandom, tracking down all their releases, including the import-only singles, and driving hundreds of miles to see them perform live in 2001, only to be horrified in 2004 when they announced their breakup following their third album, Heroes to Zeros, which I have yet to discuss. So, why were they breaking up, I thought? They were critical darlings, they were artistically amazing, they obviously had a huge creative drive, recording albums and singles and directing their own videos and backing films. They just seemed unstoppable. But alas, they weren't breaking through that thick wall of gooey dough that separated their music from true commercial crossover success. In short, they just didn't sell enough records to turn a profit and make their label happy. So at the end of the day, it was a financial thing. And I remember reading about this in, it was probably Rolling Stone. I honestly forget. Or, maybe by then I was reading about it online. I mean, it was 2004. We didn't have flat screen monitors yet. I was still breaking my back carrying my 21-inch monitor in and out of my workplace to work from home. But, Wikipedia was a thing by then. And hell, I think I was one of the early contributors to the Beta Band page on Wikipedia. And even when I review it now, I still see the fingerprints of my original edits all those years ago. I tell you, I was a real fan. Anyway, I remember reading about the breakup and just getting pissed off. Really, how could this band that so perfectly encapsulated all the things I really loved about music around the turn of the millennium, how could they fail? What was so wrong with the music industry? What was so broken that a band like this couldn't succeed? And it was around this time that I first learned what it meant to be on a record label in those days. I learned about exploitative contracts that gave the labels all the advantages and how they dug the band deep into debt right away, mostly in the form of record advances that most bands would never, ever be able to recoup. In fact, most bands would never earn nickel one despite selling thousands and thousands of records. And that sounds crazy, right? I mean, it hardly made sense to me. All I had learned of the inner workings of the music industry, I had learned from reading a pirated copy of the KLF's book, The Manual, How to Have a Number One the Easy Way, which I had, of course, downloaded off the internet. But as enlightening as that was, the manual described how an enterprising band could shortcut the label apparatus in 1988. So it had almost no relevance in 2004. It was a relic of the past. The industry had moved far beyond reliance on the radio and was now grappling with the likes of Napster and the rise of internet file sharing. Maybe that contributed to the beta band's initial demise. If it did, I don't know. I wasn't responsible. As you can see, I did my part in buying every single thing they ever released. So personally, I was crushed. I loved that band. They were groovy, they were creative, they were fun, and they mashed up influences in just the right way. I loved how they all switched instruments routinely. It made their shows and their sound unpredictable and fresh, and you never knew how they would dress up in kimonos or spacesuits or robes or fatigues, and it was always something different. And they'd end up fracturing into a bunch of different bands, none of which really captured me the way the beta band had. Although I did follow lead vocalist and guitarist Steve Mason for several years through his initial solo effort, King Biscuit Time, which I have yet to discuss, and later his incredible first proper solo album, Boys Outside, which I have yet to discuss. But for sure they left a beta-shaped hole in my heart for the last 21 years. And, you know, if that hole were an American citizen, it could now legally drink alcohol. So I suppose I've learned to live with it. And to be honest, the news lately has been so uniformly terrible, no less because Doug had passed away, that frankly I needed this bit of goodness to pick me up and get me back on my feet. So if any of the betas are listening to me now, thank you guys. I'll be there when you hit the US later this year. Somehow, some way, I will get myself to that show. And I don't care if I have to stand for 10 hours straight to do it. If I can stand and hold a goddamn sign at a protest for hours, and my friends, you know I can do that. I can surely stand in one place for hours to see one of my favorite bands come back from the dead after 20 plus years. So there you go. Some good news. Okay, on to the third and final item. I just want to talk briefly about this book that I found on my shelf that I recently reread. It's called So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star by a guy named Jake Slichter. Do you know who Jake Slichter is? Anyone? So here's a hint. I bought this book 20 years ago. And like I said, I just recently saw it on my shelf and thought, I'll give that one a reread. And I read it over a couple nights, and it stirred up a few thoughts that I wanted to share with you. Now, I bought this book in the day because it was a rock memoir. Despite not knowing the author and despite not being a fan of the band he was in, which happened to be called Semisonic. And Jake was the drummer. And Semisonic is a band that, however good they might have been, weren't nearly aggressive enough for my tastes. Of course, I only knew them from one song. And if you're of a certain age, I'm sure you know what song I mean. It was played on the radio incessantly, and I was sick of it within weeks. It was a song called Closing Time, and it was not at all what I was interested in back in 2004. Why? Because I was busy mourning the beta band, if you recall. Semisonic weren't going to fill that beta-shaped hole in my heart, were they? Anyway, this was an interesting read. Jake is an interesting guy for a rock drummer. He's something of, kind of a square, a goody two-shoes. This is definitely one rock memoir that doesn't have any sex or drugs in it. Jake's in the biz mainly for fame and glory, as far as I can tell. And given that, it's kind of puzzling to me why he's quick to point out all of his flaws, his insecurities about his drumming, his crushing recurring anxiety and stage fright, his desperate need for adulation and attention, his fixation while in the band on the statistics associated with commercial success, his difficulties in connecting with other people, especially while on tour. I mean, that Jake in this book spends his time in Semisonic building up an image of himself, a persona, as a confident rock star. He's elated when events make that more real and just crushed when fate takes it away. So I find it a little ironic that he would decide to write this warts and all expose of what it was like to be in a middlingly successful rock group in the late 90s. So it definitely torpedoes any image a fan might have had of him as a rock god. It trades that in for portraying him as a flawed human being who nevertheless took a pretty wild ride there for a few years, a ride that many of us could only dream of. I'd be very hard-pressed to name more than one Semisonic song other than Closing Time. The fact is, though, that they released 3 albums back in the day, and, they've remained friends all these years, which is more than I can say for most bands, right? And yes, they too were desperately screwed by their record label, much like the Beta Band would be a few years later. Semisonic never managed to recoup the debt they were in, thanks to the label's advance. Despite the second album going platinum, they never netted nickel one. Jake is pretty upfront, too, that the success of Closing Time was probably due, in a large part, to payola, which in the industry meant paying radio stations to play your record but not disclosing the payments. Though, of course, by the late 90s, it was a bit more sophisticated, and there were enough middlemen involved that it wasn't so clear that payola was still happening. But guess what? It was still happening. He estimates they paid somewhere just shy of $1 million to send Closing Time to number 1 and keep it there for a bunch of weeks. And I do mean the band paid that. It was billed to their recoupable debt. It earned them a 3rd album, but when that one didn't rocket to the top, the label dropped them and they went on an indefinite hiatus. Much like the Beta Band, though, they reconstituted in recent years, during COVID, in fact, and released a 4th album in 2023 after a 22-year gap. The album was well received by critics and fans alike. Did I listen to it? No, I haven't, at least not yet. But then I never said that I was a fan of Semisonic. I am, however, a fan of this book. Jake Slichter is honest in his storytelling. He has a compelling voice, and he does have some pretty fun and harrowing stories to tell, despite his straight-laced nature. And this book showed up on a list of books recommended by fellow straight-laced drummer Neil Peart, R.I.P., so I can't think of a better endorsement than that. And there you have it, folks. We did tie up those loose ends, didn't we? Yep, we sure did, and my cat is behind me now, if you haven't already heard him, telling me in no uncertain terms that it's time for me to wrap this up. So I don't even have time to complain about the weather, which, for the record, has totally sucked. Okay, now I can quit. You're listening to Stronger Than Reason, either on YouTube or on the podcast platform of your choice, the show that would like to remind you of one important thing. This isn't a whorehouse, it's a whore home. As always, thanks for listening, and until next time, stay strong.